Up until now, we have written many unit tests for the controller and service classes. We know that unit tests run in isolation, and we need to define mocks. Integration tests, as the name suggests, focus on integrating different layers of the application. So we're testing the entire Spring Boot application from end to end. That is, from controller all the way to the repository and the database. That also means no mocking is involved. We run our integration tests against the testing data stored in the H2 database. In this video, I also want to introduce how to create integration tests while the Spring security is on. Let's get to it. So let's create an integration test for the artifact. Let's call it artifact controller integration test. Add Spring Boot test. Add auto-config mock MVC. And here we can also do a display name. This annotation is optional. Integration tests for artifact API endpoints. We can also give it a tag. Let's call it integration. Okay, so the last two are optional. Now, as usual, we need to inject mock MVC. Add auto-wired mock MVC. And also, we need to inject the base URL. API.endpoint.base-URL. So first, let's try to write an integration test for find all artifacts. Add test void test find all artifacts success. So this dot mock MVC dot perform, and here should be a GET request. This dot base URL plus artifacts dot accept media type dot application JSON. Okay. Then, as usual, we're going to expect several things. JSON path, $.flag, and we have to import this guy here, and make sure we're picking the second one, web.servlet.result. Dot value is true. Okay, then we can copy and paste. We have one for code, one for message, and one for data. And here should be status code dot success, and this should be find all success. And for the last one, we're not using this, and we're comparing it with matchers dot has size 6. Now remember, we created 6 artifacts and saved them into the database. Now here, there's a problem importing it. It's actually mock MVC request builders dot. Okay, so let's add this exception to signature. And if you think this is too long, you can get rid of this and just import, like here, just import the static method. All right. Okay. So the only mock we have is this mock MVC because we have to simulate an HTTP request. Other than that, we're not mocking anything. We're not mocking service. We're not mocking repository. When this test case is launched, then we're basically testing this entire Spring Boot application from end to end, from controller all the way to H2 database. So let's launch it. Do you think it will pass? It should be, right? Okay, great. It passed. Very good. Next, let's test add artifact. To save you some time, I have already copied the code in the clipboard. So let me paste it here. Okay, it means we also need to inject object mapper. Auto-wired object mapper. Okay, now you're happy. This is very similar to the controller unit test add artifact success. So here we created a new artifact, then we serialize it into JSON using object mapper from Jackson, and then we perform post and attach this JSON string. And we're expecting true success, add success, and so on. We also add one more test here, which is after adding this to the database, so now instead of 6 artifacts, there should be 7. Okay, so because this is an integration testing, we're really inserting this artifact into the H2 database. Okay. And let's run this test and see the result. Run test add artifact success. Do you think it will pass? Well, it failed. Well, that's odd. So let's look at the error message. And here it says, full authentication is required to access this resource. That means this integration test fails, not because of the logic is not correct, simply because we forget to attach the JSON web token. So the question is, how do we perform testing when Spring Security is on? And here is one solution. Do you remember there is an annotation called @before_each? @before_each. And here we're going to define a method called setup. This method is annotated by @before_each. That means it will get called before each test case is executed. So this is a perfect opportunity that we can acquire a valid JWT. And here, let's create a field to hold this JWT. Let's call it string token. Okay. First, we have to use this dot mock MVC to log in. Dot perform. So this time it is a post. And if you remember, the URL is this dot base URL plus users login. Then how do we attach username and password with mock MVC? And here is the syntax. Dot with. Now we cannot proceed because we're missing a dependency. So let's go to Google Chrome and let's search Spring Security Test Maven. Okay, so this is what we're looking for. So copy this and go back to IntelliJ and open pom.xml. Let's add this dependency in. We don't need this. Okay, then load Maven dependencies. Okay, so now we have the Spring Security test. Let's go back here and continue. With HTTP basic John, and here is the password 123456. So make sure we import it. Okay. Let's make sure this guy's happy. And we're going to save the result into something called result actions. And let's call this result actions. Okay, so let me break it so you can see it clearly. Next, our task is to retrieve this returned JWT and assign it to this.token, the private field. And here's how we do that. Result actions dot and do print. And this guy here is actually from, yes, that's right. Dot and return. Okay, we're going to save the returned value into MVC result. We're almost there. MVC result dot get response dot get content as string. Okay. Now remember, this is what a response looks like. And we're only interested in the token under data. So here is how we retrieve the token. So first, let's convert this string, content as string, into a JSON object. New JSON object. And we're going to pass in this JSON string. And then we can assign to this token bearer space plus the JSON web token. Here is the syntax. JSON dot get JSON object with name data dot get string, because this is a property in this JSON object, and it's called token. Okay, so here I'm going to add a comment. Don't forget to add bearer space as a prefix. Okay, so this method gets called before every test case. So we're making sure that this.token has the latest and valid token. So now let's go down here. This.markmvc.perform post. Besides content type, we also need to have a header. As you can see, the header accepts two things, name and value. And if you remember that, we need to save that bearer token in authorization request header. So here is authorization, and here is this dot token. That's it. So we're making a post request to this URL. And here is header 1, content type equals to application JSON. And here is header 2, authorization is equal to this.token. And here is the request body. And this is another header, accept is equal to application.json. For this one, since viewing artifacts don't need authentication, so we don't have to attach this header. All right, so let's launch this again and see if it works. Great, it passed. So remember, if you are defining an integration test while the Spring security is on, make sure in the add before each setup method, you request the token first. And for every test case, you can attach that JWT in the header. Okay, now let me test the two test cases and run all the test cases in this class. Do you think they will pass? Well, it's interesting. Add artifact passed, but test find all artifacts failed. What happened? So let's double click and scroll down. Well, it's interesting because the test case right here is expecting 6 artifacts, but actually what was returned has 7 artifacts. Why? The problem here is integration tests modify the database, so the order of executing those test cases really matters. So for example, if we execute this test case in this order, first test find all artifacts, it will pass because initially the database has 6 artifacts, and then we add 1, it becomes 7. But in this case, even though we defined the test case in this order, but guess what? IntelliJ chose to test add artifact first. So after testing add artifact success, there's a side effect. That is, this remember all is added into the database. So now there are 7 instead of 6 artifacts. So of course this guy will fail. So the order of test cases matters a lot because this is an integration test. We're not mocking. Everything is real. If you add 1, if you remove 1, that is permanent in H2 database. Then how do we solve the problem? And of course, you can give an ordering to those test cases, but let me show you a better solution. Let's add something called add dirties context. And here we have method mode is equal to method mode dot before method. So simply put, add dirties context here will reset the database before this method gets called. So even though test add artifact success modified the database, before running test find all artifact success, H2 will be reset. This is pretty convenient. Okay, as a homework, please complete this artifact controller integration test. And also, please create an integration test for Hogwarts user and wizard. In Hogwarts user, make sure you also write test cases to test methods that need admin authority. For example, if you logged in as Eric, then you cannot perform add a user, modify a user, or delete a user. Okay, so let's run the test again to test. Now this time, both test cases will pass. Okay, great. But also remember, the drawback of this one is now this time, this is more time consuming because every time it has to restart the entire Spring application and also reset the H2 database. So use this with caution. Okay, now let's try to run all the tests. Run tests in Java. We got some problems, but as you can see, now we have 57 tests. Oh, we have 6 failed tests. Okay, so let's look at them one by one. Test save. We got a null pointer exception, cannot invoke password encoder. Oh, yes, because we just added the encoder, so we're not marking this. All right, let's go to user service test. This is easy. So let's go all the way to here. And let's mark this. Add mark password encoder. Password encoder. Then let's go back to this test case. Given this dot password encoder dot encode, and here should be new user dot get password. If this gets called, instead of really encoding it, it will return just something like this. Encoded password. Okay. It should work. So let's run it. Okay, it passed. All right, but that we lost everything else. So we have to run it again. It looks like all the problems are in this artifact controller test. So let's click here. Oh, okay, so the problem is for authentication is required. Now, this is a controller test, and this is supposed to be a unit test. Because we're marking, go up, we're marking artifact service. But still, this mark MVC will try to hit that API endpoint. If an API endpoint needs authentication, that will fail. So let's try to turn off Spring Security during controller unit test. So here is how we do it. Add filters equals to false. Because Spring Security depends on something called servlet filters. You have seen that there is a security filter chain. If we turn off all the filters, basically that turns off Spring Security. So if you do not want to test with Spring Security, just turn off. And line 31 is the syntax. So let's run everything here again. They all passed. And to be safe, let's do a final test. Okay, all tests passed. And I wonder what happened in Wizard Controller. Okay, so here I have already added add filters equal to false. And I guess same thing is here in user controller test. Yes. Okay. Just make sure you have this in all the controller unit tests. All right. Don't forget the homework. Make sure you complete the integration test for Artifact Controller and also define some integration tests for Wizard Controller and User Controller. I hope you have learned how to perform integration tests while Spring Security is on. I will see you in the next video.